Hello to everybody. Welcome to another episode of HR Nightmares. I'm Lisa Leath, and I'm here with
Amy Conway
and
Beth Looney.
Hey, we're the OG ladies here. This is an episode that I don't think it's going to be controversial. We're just like literally trying to give you some real talk and advice, but real talk and advice on ice. We are going to talk about immigration enforcement and how to, I don't know, look, it's just
best
our
prepare,
take on best preparing, if the cops show up at your workplace and threaten to or do take some of your employees, or come into the office. So I think about this and it totally, I don't get stressed, like literally could throw me into any stressful situation. This idea does stress me out. And so I think if it stresses me out, and like I did that emotional intelligence assessment or whatever, and there's a piece on it in stress, and it's like literally like I could handle anything, and this would stress me the hell out. So I think if it would stress me out, it's going to stress everybody out. I'm so curious to hear people that have dealt with this already. How you are handling it, and was it right? Was it wrong? Would you have done anything differently? But like, let's talk about what's actually happening. Like, have you guys read in the news any specific examples, heard from your friends of it even happening where we live and work in southeastern North Carolina? Like, what's your perspective on ICE raids and preparing for them?
I mean, I don't have any specific examples to reference of this, but I mean, I understand how it's stressful, because to me, it's like, these are human beings and it's their lives. And I can't imagine, how stressful that potential employee might feel or whatever's happening in the business. So yeah, I feel for this one. I think this is hard. And I think the stressful part about it is it's so unknown, right? There's no warning, right?
I think each community is probably handling it differently. For instance, I got an email from our superintendent where we live. I thought it was really well drafted. Go back to our last episode on AI. It didn't seem like it was drafted by ChatGPT, but I hope we got some help from AI. But it was like really informative on how like the school district was partnering with the sheriff's department and ICE, and like just tried to set parents like at ease to know that their children's like education was most important, like safety of everyone, including the teachers and the sheriffs that are on site as the safety up. Like that's also super, super important. And like, human feelings and emotions are going to be in play, but like that the authorities and the school district were like working together. I thought that was a fantastic, like proactive communication. So I just wonder, like, in different communities, how, law enforcement, federal law enforcement and like local law enforcement are working together with employers and school districts to just like play nice. I don't know.
I know I have an example, but it's from a long time ago, from 2014, when I worked at a local manufacturing company, and we had an employee who was able to work in the United States. He had, the
visa?
Yeah, he had
Work
a visa,
authorization.
work authorization. And so he was great. And he one weekend got into a really bad bar fight. Super nice guy, worked in the warehouse, just upstanding guy. And that was one of the conditions, I guess, for him to be in the United States. And so we got notification that he was going to be deported.
Yeah, you can't get in any kind of legal
criminal activity.
Was devastating. It was devastating because he had worked there for a number of years, was really just a great team player. I mean, he was always the first to volunteer for anything. And so what the plant manager and I did was, you have to kind of go along with those requirements and the requests. But we did see if he needed to have an attorney. And we paid for an attorney for him. It didn't work. He still had to be deported. But it was just really, really sad. It was gut-wrenching. And then what we did is we kind of set up some support for the people that were in his department and for the rest of the company.
Yeah.
It was devastating.
I bet. Here's a piece of advice I think might be helpful for folks. If you have folks on work authorizations or visas just go back and take a quick little audit and make sure that they're valid for a while. If the expiration date is coming up, just check in with that person. Like, hey, did you go ahead and file an extension or reapply?
Sometimes they don't know. I've had that a lot.
So
where I've always
I mean,
reminded them.
Listen, I think the big thing we have to remember is it's a lot of paperwork involved in those workplace authorizations. For many of the employees in my experience that have that they're from other countries. English is a second language. There's a lot of confusion on the forms and how many forms you need and are they up to date? And I thought I did it correctly, but I didn't. So again, it's no wonder that people are like, ooh, it expires. I didn't realize it. Those dates come up for all of us in life, right? Yeah,
and I don't know.
I think whenever I start with one of our clients, the first thing I do is go through all of the employee files. And I did have it happen last year where I was kind of auditing. It was a new client, so I was going through all their employee files. That was part of me being on board. Was they needed some cleanup of those files, and they had someone that the expiration was coming due in 2 months, right? And so I called, I emailed, I'm like, hey, I'm the new HR consultant. Like, are you aware that your workplace authorization, expires, say March 31st or whatever it is. And have you filed for extension or your paperwork in order? And push comes to shove, I don't think it was, in order, but at least that's part of what we can do as human resources and HR professionals is getting all of that paperwork in order, auditing our files every year, looking at those I-9s. When new people come in, making sure we're taking the right identification and we're actually looking. And I think now with I worry a lot of all of these remote companies and all of them that aren't physically looking at IDs. And I'm like, you can't spot the fake social security card unless you feel it in your hands, right? Like those ridges, you got to feel those ridges on those pillars, right? Like my old school, how I learned, in those methods. So sometimes it's harder to spot when they're not real IDs, legitimate IDs, when we're doing all this online stuff. So I do worry a little bit on some of our remote companies where, they're not spotting that or they're not using E-Verify yet because they have less than 25, right? 25 employees. So they're not having to use E-Verify yet. And it's they just don't have good parameters for double checking all of that. And that's a way, obviously, businesses, HR, and it does protect the individual too, because what we don't want is them to be pulled out of the workplace and deported somewhere. And
they just invested 9 years of their life at your manufacturing firm, and you could have paid $1,200 to an attorney. They just get right. The extensions are pretty easy to file if you're an attorney, right? And so if you need a recommendation for an immigration attorney, the visas and the extension, it is relatively affordable, right? To get somebody a visa. The permanent residency is quite a bit more. I've seen around $20,000 to get a green card, but you have to be here on a visa and blah, blah, blah. But the visas aren't that expensive. So if you've got somebody who's fantastic and they need your support because they don't have the $1,000, $5,000 to file the extension, get the visa themselves, it's probably worth it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's a big way that businesses can support when they're thinking about how do we prepare if there's a potential, if INS comes in and wants to audit our files and do all this. Again, it's if we see someone in here, let's get ahead of it. That's how we can be prepared by actually being prepared.
And then also
Don't let it be a surprise.
Your employees. And we had one with one of the clients that we had for a long time who had those work authorization papers. And every January, it would be a reminder. I would send out a reminder. Just so that was on their forefront that they needed to get it done in September. But it was I just wanted to make sure that they had that.
Now, I'm sure we have no clients that have known employees that are working on false social security.
Yeah, I don't have any in my current, at least. I have one that we use E-Verify. I run it, or the CFO runs it. We got all of those clear. I did have one of my current clients where we did have a situation, but the hiring manager hired them and really wanted them. And the minute, the COO and I saw the paperwork, we were like, no. And I gave the gentleman 14 days or 30 days or whatever. I'm like, listen, we can have him work for a couple of weeks. And if he has let me give him every opportunity to give me any kind of paperwork, but in the end, there was no paperwork. And unfortunately we were like, we can't, and I think he had,
he could have started his own business, paid taxes, and never,
he was
got his refund.
He was not here illegally.
Surprise.
He actually was. He had parted ways with the company that sponsored his visa, so it was like he needed to find a new company to sponsor his visa.
Right.
We were not. It wasn't the timeline that we were able to do that, and we weren't going to pay the money. It's a really small business to do that. So basically, we said like, can we find him some other companies locally that do sponsor these visas so he can transfer that visa? So he was on a visa, just like we couldn't take it because we couldn't accept that kind of visa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think too, like, if you've got, like, I've got a guy that is here illegally. He's been here for 20 years and he's my best foreman. And like, you should just help that guy out and like for the next couple of years, keep applying to the lottery. Mm-hmm. I think that's the way to go for somebody that's been here. You know it. You've been kind of like paying them, even though you know they're here illegally. Like you should get right with them. And for $4,000 or whatever, like if it's a long time employee, you should do that.
Well, it was interesting for that person that was deported back to Honduras. They had never really remembered living there because they had lived in the United States for such a long time.
Yeah.
And so
it's sad.
it was devastating. So yeah, I agree. The employers, we can supply a lot of help to these folks.
What about?
And we should. I think it's our responsibility.
Let's say we're running a manufacturing plant and ice comes in and like the receptionist lets them in and it's like, because we didn't prep the receptionist and say, I guess there's a bunch of employers out there that are they have a philosophy like if ICE shows up, we won't let them in, or we'll meet them in the lobby and we'll tell them that, we'll see if this person's here. While others are saying, sure, like if ICE shows up, like let them in. And if they've got to take somebody with them, like that's their job. And
is it sort of like a subpoena though? They have to have a subpoena. They can look for one particular person, but then, so if they were looking for me and they saw you, they couldn't. No,
take
it
us
has
all.
to be. Yeah, it would have to be.
Well, I think that's part of the whole like being prepared. Do you know the rules and regulations of the access of ICE in your building, right? Because at the end of the day, these are private companies and people just can't come in just because they're a part of certain organizations of our federal government. Like that just doesn't work that way. There are certain like guidelines that need to be followed. So again, have you educated yourself as a business owner to even know like, do I have to let them in? Do I have to give them this employee's information? Like, what do I have to do and not have to do? What should I do to act in best effort and faith of both, the government agency and the law, and also the people in which I employ, right? And so I think that's part of like what we probably would preach the most is just like you've got to actually just be prepared. You have to understand what is happening.
Even if you don't think like you're like, I'm not going to stereotype and like, maybe you've got 400 people like in the company. And I don't think that I have, HR took care of like the onboarding. And I don't think that I have, meanwhile, like there's 1,900 I-9s that are screwed up. Like
I have a funny story. One of our clients, like when I first started working for Leath HR, one of the first clients that you assigned me to, I laughed because I went in and did an audit and it was a small org and like, they just needed a quick overview of like what was going on. It was a small org, a team of like 7 or 8 people. Right. Yeah. And I remember the first question I asked in kind of our audit is, okay, so tell me about your I-9s, right? The compliance section is kind of first. So I'm like, tell me about your I-9s. Like, where do you keep them? Like, who kind of does that on day one? And the owners were like, what's an I-9? Yeah. I'm like, okay. And they laugh, they joke. They're like, uh-oh. First question, we already failed the audit. I'm like, that's why we're here? That's why we're here.
There's no judgment.
But I laughed and I kind of explained it. And the owner, said, oh, Amy, you don't have to worry about that. Everyone here is like from the US. And I'm like, well, let's just verify that.
Just prove
How about
it?
we get those that thrown onto the forms and we get people's IDs and we just verify that.
Oh
I'm
my
sure
God.
they are.
Yes.
But
Because it's
you
required.
don't know. What's her name could be from Canada. I have no idea.
Well,
right?
and now is the time, like, I hate compliance. Like, it's the worst part of our function. But this is a time when you probably need to get your shit right.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like, go
Yeah.
get the I-9s completed.
Get your shit right.
Yeah.
They're coming. But it's
they're
the
coming.
truth.
Get your shit right. They're coming.
Well, especially if you're in certain fields, like if you're
Yeah.
in certain industries, like manufacturing,
hospitality, manufacturing,
Construction.
If you have a lot of low skilled workers, basically, right? Like people who are more hourly labor type intensive roles,
You want to
you're
get
being
right.
targeted. So get your shit together.
Yeah. 100%. Now is not the time to like assume everything's cool with the onboarding paperwork. You really need to go back and audit that. The fines are pretty bad right now,
Yeah,
and they're
yeah.
I think they're incremental. Like once and by the way, like you don't need to get dinged on a stupid I-9. It takes 3 seconds to fill out. And then once they start uncovering that that's not right, then they're going to start digging into every other thing under the
Right.
sun. It's kind of like when you get like a DOL or an EOC charge and like somebody shows up to talk to you about it. And it's like, okay, first of all, definitely meet them in the lobby. But like,
Yeah, you don't have to give them access. To
but
everything.
don't give them access to anything, because the second that they like open up your files,
like, aha.
the world is their oyster.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I mean, you just
you don't have
need
to give them all your documentation, but
just give them what they ask for.
Well, and I think that, that's such an interesting thing of just like going back and reviewing those forms, and like even the clients we have that, probably have, yes, all legal authorization on all those I-9s, but I'm like, well, who would know? Because you didn't fill out the form or sign it. Right. So it's just like, it's good to just
need to go back
now.
and
this is
refix
the
them.
time. I remember, I worked at Nordstrom for 18 years, and the years that I was in HR and I was an HR manager in stores, we used to like have an audit. We had a compliance team and they would come audit every location every year.
Can you imagine that being your job?
Terrible. It was usually the
It's
HR
Friday
director
night,
that
and I don't
had to
have
help
anyone to
do
go out
it,
with.
And
I wonder
and
why.
it was part of like, when you were an HR manager, it was kind of part of your like annual scorecard. I remember like I was up for a big like company award, HR manager of the year, whatever. Like if I didn't pass the audit, like I was not getting that nomination. Right.
Yeah.
And so I remember I had to go find some points in the audit because it was close, because I had just taken over this store and it was a mess. And this is not 1,000, it's 1,000 current employees, and then all the people that have worked there in a 30-year tenure of that location. Well, obviously not 30 because we hadn't turned whatever the 7 years back, right? Of all the terms. I mean, it was thousands of files. And you know how many HR people probably were in and out of those offices throughout a period of 10, 12 years or whatever? Oh my God.
When I
It would
was
take
in-
me
This is an
weeks.
opportunity for AI.
There was
Yes.
one year I was like, I'm just going to fail. I can't. There's no way I can spend time when we're hiring 500 new people and we're going through a $30 million remodel and we have construction in the building. Like, I'm just going to fail this audit. It's fine.
My
That
God.
was when
Yeah.
I was in grad school. That was one of, you had to have some practical experience. So I was down at the city looking at all of their I-9s from like, I don't know, 20 years. It was a room like this size.
I think I did
And
that
they're
at Central Employment with Corning. Yeah.
Start at A. I was like,
Awesome.
but it looks
A for
really
awesome.
far to get to see. I was
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh. And that was all I did. Every day
Yeah.
I would go in there. Like,
But
hey,
you learn a
ladies.
lot. I mean, I do remember being an HR coordinator and like a young HR person my first year in HR. And by auditing those files, like I really learned how to get good at making sure those things were complete.
I used to sit and like when I had nothing to do in my internship, I would like pull out the files, all the union employees like in Corning, New York, and I pull out their files and I just read all the disciplines and grievances. And it was like,
You get to know the employees well.
Yeah, it was just so good. Yeah, you do learn a lot.
Yeah.
This happened to me when I was young in my career, and maybe it would happen to someone else. There was destruction, I guess, like some vandalism that happened at one of the facilities, and the police came and they wanted
Zoo?
to do, well,
Maybe.
Okay. So they wanted to do an investigation. They wanted to see disgruntled employees, and they wanted to look at all of the employee files.
Wait, who was they?
The police department.
The police department. But no, you did.
Exactly.
Did you? Yeah,
No, I didn't.
But
I remember being really young and
Yeah.
standing by. I'm like, I don't think that's right. And there was
See, your
nobody.
gut instinct
Yeah, I
was
was like,
right.
you can't
Like,
do
do you
that.
have a subpoena? Are you a lawyer that's
They're like,
telling
we
me I
just
got
want
to
to
supply you that?
We want to look
No.
through all of the files. I'm like, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was funny, but I was so young.
So, I mean, put yourself in a young, shift supervisor's shoes. They're on night shift and they don't really watch the news. They get all their news from TikTok and they have no idea this is like possibly a thing that's going to happen. Like we have an obligation to prepare, anyone who's there when like the main management team's not there.
Yeah.
We probably, if we think there could be a situation, like maybe even come up with some kind of like team member communication and just like proactively communicate, like how would you handle it if somebody, just to get everybody sort of aligned. And then also what would you do if like a bunch of people got ripped out of your workforce and like, number one, from like a business disruption, like that's one thing. You're going to probably lose some money and have to recruit and backfill or whatever. But number two, there's the camaraderie and the cultural fabric gets a tear in it. And so how do you take care of your folks and make sure that they don't hate you for following the law, but also, you provide them resources. And I don't know, I bring a therapist in. And
I think it's the time to really lean in. And if you're not naturally good at empathy, find some help to support you in empathy, right?
Yeah.
So bringing in almost, some kind of, does your EAP have access to grief counselors that come in? We did that if we would have someone that passed away in a location or something.
Yeah.
So this is a similar thing, right? If, your best example, right? This is someone who worked in our organization for a really long time and
Really
had relationships and was really well liked and respected. And those relationships were probably in and outside of work. And our people have great empathy for that, as they should, and we would want them to. So again, this is the time for leaders to really lean in and check in with their people and reinforce what the true messaging is. You know, this is the time to get a communication plan, even if you don't ever need to use it. Have one prepared.
You've
what
got
you're going to say.
You've got a plan for a hurricane. You've got a plan if there's a fire.
Put this in your emergency guide, right?
And let everybody at the front desk know how to do it for sure.
How does that shift supervisor respond? Give them some talking points. Put it in that ERT book or, ER, whatever your guide is called.
Team guidelines and expectations.
Sure. Well, emergency response. I was going for emergency response team, but that's why the T. Yeah. But give them some talking points and make sure they understand. Again, this is part of being prepared, is making sure anyone in the organization feels like they're comfortable. We used to have this happen all the time, like these silly things, like especially when I worked in Washington, D.C. and I was there for a decade, where people would show up to the workplace that there was a lot of security clearance checking that would happen of like former employees. And these people from these government agencies would show up and just be like, I need access to this employee's file. And I'm like, do you have some kind of written authorization from that employee? And, but I'm here like knowing and dealing with this all the time. Sometimes they would deal with like my manager in charge of the store, who really was just my like kid shoe manager. They didn't know, and they would
they're like,
hand
sure,
over.
here's
I'm
the
like,
room.
no, just because they say they're from this government agency doesn't mean we just hand them over an employee file.
Or the
We're a
police.
private company.
Right.
That's people's personal data. Do they have the authorization from that individual that I can give them? And then they need to fax it to me. Don't just show up in front of my store and expect I'm going to drop everything I'm doing and do this now. I'm like, give me a break. But it would happen all the time. And that's usually about what I would say to those individuals too. Like, give me a break. When do you need this back? I'm happy to give it to you on my schedule, not yours.
There was a client, speaking of a different kind of thing, but a client once asked, hey, we want to hire this person, but they're not eligible to work in the United States, but that's okay, right? I was like, no, it's not really. And they're like, well, we'll take responsibility for it.
Okay.
It was really tough.
That's
but
why
sometimes
I like
it's hard.
great HR business partners.
Yeah, and you're
say,
just like, these are the
no,
options for you, and I'm going to
no.
highly recommend that we don't do this.
Also-
and when we turn this off,
Yeah.
I'll tell you who it is.
And
I'll be
then,
surprised.
when they say
No, I
like,
won't.
but we appreciate your recommendation and we trust your expertise, we're going to do it anyways. That's usually when I say, okay, well then I can't work with you anymore because legally,
Yeah.
like I have to make sure that I'm
Yes.
the one that signs the I-9 form. So no.
Yeah, that's true. We do have an indemnification, but if you're signing the I-9 forms, that's an issue with the
That's
government.
what I said. I was like,
Yeah,
well,
that-
unfortunately,
yeah.
if the
That's
person
a
has to take
federal-
the I-9
yeah.
form, like,
Yeah.
no.
All right,
I don't look good in orange, so I'm not going to do
You
it.
can sign. Yeah, they can sign it themselves. The I-9.
Yeah.
You know what I found too? That's a good example. Like a lot of times, the managers who are desperate to just like, oh well, just brush it under.
It doesn't matter.
They don't actually know the right questions to ask. So like the person may just need to extend their sponsorship, or they have a sponsorship but they need a new sponsor. They may be in the green card process. They may be in a better place than this person even understands, but like it's just good to leverage an HR expert whenever there's or an immigration attorney, or both, whenever there's any question of like, should we employ this person? Are they eligible to be employed here? Like, let us ask the questions, because most of the time, a lot of HR people don't even deal with immigration stuff a lot.
No,
and
yeah.
there's so many different nuances, rules, visas, work authorizations, like, and lotteries and stuff. And I mean, like, don't do it yourself. Bring some experts in, the HR leaders, the immigration attorney, and just like let us talk to the candidate ourselves. Don't assume anything.
Well, I mean,
That's great
sometimes
advice.
I say like you can hire whoever you want, but when they show up on day one, this is what they've got to supply to me, and if it doesn't go through, we're not continuing their employment past the 3 days that they've got to give me the documents. So sometimes I say, like, is that a great representation of our company? Do you want to go through that, right? Because, I mean, really, it's like if the person said yes, they are authorized to work in the United States on that application or whatever we asked them, then it's like, okay, we'll find out on day one. And if there's a problem, let me be the one to go through these documents. I'm the expert. I'm the one that went through the I-9 training. I can ask them if they have something different. If they have a document that shows their extension date, they have that 30, 60, 90 paper that they filed for it, and I can give them to the deadline on that paper. I don't expect hiring managers to know all of that stuff. So usually I'm like, bring me on day one and let's see. Yeah.
What else can people do? Any final thoughts on what workplaces, managers can do to get prepared for ICE?
I think Beth made a comment earlier, which was get to know your people. And I think that's really true. I think this is a time that not to go out there and profile any of your folks, right? But even people who are here legally and have the documentation, if they immigrated from another country, they may be feeling nervousness. They may have family that they're living with at home that don't have the right work. So even if we don't fear for that employee, we should care enough about them and their lives to lean in and see how they're doing, right? And that may extend beyond their own authorization to work in this country. Again, they have friends, they have family, maybe not all in their environment, right? And there's just a sense of worry, even for the people who do have the paperwork. I think they're still living in fear of what could happen. So I think just now is the time to really, like, again, if you're not the most naturally empathetic, lean in, get to know your people, find your leaders in the org that are, get some other people to lean on, but check in with your people and see how they're feeling.
Agree.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. On that note, we are HR consultants, but we're not your HR consultants. They would love to be your HR consultants. Make sure you go check Leath HR Group out on all the socials, leathhrgroup.com. If you have a question, we love answering audience write-ins. So if you have a burning desire to ask some HR leaders an anonymous question, feel free to go to our website, click on HR Nightmares, and you can submit a question. We'll answer it on the next episode. Please tell your friends, anybody, if you think this episode was interesting whatsoever, share it, hit a like, hit subscribe. We're on YouTube, everywhere that you listen to podcasts. We're thankful that you tuned in today. Let us know what you thought in the comments, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.